Callaway County, Missouri, June 23, 1855. It was a Tuesday. The corn was tall, and the heat was the kind that made the air shimmer above the soil, that made sounds carry too far across the open fields. On the farm of a man named Robert Newsom, 70 acres, 6 enslaved people, a 2-story house with clean white paint on the shutters. A 19-year-old girl stood in a small cabin and waited to see whether the man who owned her would come again that night. His name was Robert Newsom. He was 60 years old. He was a grandfather. He had been raping her since the day he purchased her. She had been 14 years old. She had asked his daughters for help. She had asked his son. She had stood in the farmhouse kitchen and, with whatever words a girl who had never been allowed to learn to read could assemble, made clear what their father was doing to her in the dark. She had begged. They had done nothing. And so, on the night of June 23, 1855, 5 years into her captivity, 19 years old and pregnant for the second time, with this man's child, Celia picked up a large stick from the pile of wood near the fireplace in her cabin. She waited. When Robert Newsom opened her cabin door, she hit him. She hit him again. She hit him until he stopped moving. And then, because she understood exactly what Missouri law was going to do to her when the sun came up, she spent the rest of that night trying to destroy the evidence. She burned what she could. She scattered the ashes. By morning, she had told one person what she'd done. A man named George, who also lived enslaved on the Newsom farm. George told the family before the day was out. Celia was arrested before sunset. What happened next? The trial, the legal argument, the verdict, the appeal, the execution, and most of all, the specific document that the state of Missouri went to extraordinary lengths to keep from ever being read. That story would not reach the public for 130 years. Because this wasn't just the story of one girl and one man on one farm in Missouri. It was the story of a legal system that had to decide, in open court, whether an enslaved woman had the right to say no. And the answer that system gave, recorded in black ink in a bound ledger, was so damning, so clear about what slavery actually was, that the people responsible for that answer spent the next century and a half making sure it stayed buried. Celia was hanged on December 21st, 1855. She was 19 years old. The trial record was not made publicly available until 1991. This is the story they tried to erase. This is Hollow Century. Before we go any further into what happened in that Callaway County courtroom in 1855, I need you to do something. Subscribe to Hollow Century right now. Hit that notification bell. Because what we're about to go through tonight is exactly the kind of story that powerful institutions spend generations trying to keep out of classrooms, out of textbooks, and off your screen. This case was buried in a Missouri courthouse archive for over a century. We found it. We're telling it. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Let's see how far this truth travels. Now, let's go back to Missouri. To understand what happened to Celia, to understand why her trial unfolded the way it did, why the verdict was what it was, why the appeal was constructed the way it was, and why the entire record of those proceedings had to be hidden. You have to understand what Missouri was in 1855, not the mythology, the reality. Missouri had entered the Union in 1821 as a slave state, the result of the Missouri Compromise, the first of the great American political bargains that attempted to manage the contradiction between a nation founded on liberty and an economy built on human bondage. By 1855, there were roughly 100,000 enslaved people in Missouri. They represented an enormous portion of the state's agricultural wealth, its domestic labor force, its entire economic infrastructure in the counties along the Missouri River. The region locals called Little Dixie, where planters from Kentucky and Virginia had brought their enslaved workforces west and built an economy designed to mirror the plantation South. Callaway County was the heart of Little Dixie. In Callaway County in 1855, an enslaved person was not a person under the law. This is not a metaphor or a rhetorical simplification. It was a legal fact, codified in Missouri statutes, upheld in Missouri courts, enforced by Missouri sheriffs. An enslaved person was property. The legal category was chattel, movable goods, the same category as livestock, as farm equipment, as furniture. The same rules of ownership, transfer, and disposal applied. This mattered in every practical way. An enslaved person could not own property, could not enter into a contract, could not marry legally, could not testify in court against a white person, could not, under Missouri law, as it existed in 1855, claim any right of self-defense against the person who owned them. That last point is the one that Celia's trial would force into the open, because Missouri law also contained a statute, passed in 1845, that protected women from rape. The law read that any woman who used force, even lethal force, to protect herself from sexual assault was legally justified. The law was written in plain language. Any woman. The question the state of Missouri would have to answer in the fall of 1855 was simple, brutal, and, for the architects of the slave system, extraordinarily dangerous. Was Celia a woman? The answer to that question would determine everything. If she was a woman, Missouri's own rape protection statute applied. Her act of self-defense was legal. She could not be convicted of murder. If she was not a woman, if legally she was only property, then she had killed her owner, which was the most serious crime an enslaved person could commit. The penalty, death. Everything else that happened in the fall of 1855 flowed from that single question. And the men who controlled Missouri's legal system knew that whatever answer they gave, they were answering it for every enslaved woman in the state, for every enslaved woman in the South. They could not afford to answer it at an ass. The other thing you need to understand about Missouri in 1855 is the temperature. Political, not meteorological. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had passed just the year before, reopening the question of whether slavery would spread into the new Western territories and detonating what historians later called Bleeding Kansas, a guerrilla war between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers on Missouri's western border. The national argument about slavery was approaching a pitch that the country's political structures could no longer absorb. Missouri's pro-slavery establishment was not in a mood to have one of their own courts produce a ruling that could be used by abolitionists as proof that slavery required the law to treat women as things. Celia's trial wasn't just about Celia. It never was. It was about whether the system could sustain the scrutiny of being asked, in open court, to name itself. Her name was Celia. We do not know her last name with certainty. In every document she appears in, the bill of sale, the trial record, the court testimony, she is listed only as Celia, or as a Negro girl named Celia. Some historians, in the years since her story emerged, have referred to her as Celia Newsom, using the surname of the man who owned her, which is its own kind of horror. We will call her Celia. She was born around 1836. Where? We don't know. Missouri, most likely, or possibly one of the border states. Kentucky, Tennessee. Records of enslaved births were kept only sporadically, only when they served an owner's economic interest in documenting property. And Celia was not someone whose birth anyone recorded for her own sake. What we can reconstruct from the trial record, from testimony given under oath by people who knew her, and from the few documents that survived, is the outline of a life that had almost no room for anything except survival. She came to Robert Newsom's farm in the spring of 1850. The bill of sale records the transaction, $850, paid for a Negro girl named Celia, $850. In 1850, that was a significant sum, more than a skilled craftsman earned in 2 years. It reflected Celia's value as a worker and, as the subsequent years would make brutally clear, as something else entirely. She was approximately 14 years old. Robert Newsom was a widower. He had buried his wife some time before, and he had adult children, daughters named Virginia and Mary, and a son named Harry, who lived on or near the property. He was, by all outward appearances, a respectable figure in Callaway County. He owned land, paid taxes, attended the right church, had the kind of slow, authoritative manner that passed for dignity in a culture organized around the deference of everyone who wasn't white and male and propertied. Celia was raped on the road home from the slave market. The trial testimony establishes this with clinical directness. Robert Newsom did not wait until they reached the farm. The act of purchase was, in his understanding, an act of total possession. He exercised what he believed to be his right immediately, without ceremony, without concealment, in the way a man exercises a right he has never been asked to justify. She was 14 years old. What that journey home felt like for her. The shock, the pain, the terror of understanding what her life had become in a single afternoon. Those things are not in the record. They couldn't be. Celia could not write. Celia could not speak publicly. Celia's interior experience was not something the legal system that would eventually try to kill her had any interest in documenting. What we know is what she did. She survived. That's the first thing. For 5 years, she survived. She learned the rhythms of the farm, the planting seasons, the harvest schedules, the routines that gave each day its shape. She worked. She cooked, cleaned, spun thread, hauled water, tended the kitchen garden. She was the only enslaved woman on the Newsom property for much of her time there, which meant she was responsible for virtually all domestic labor, in addition to whatever field work was required. She formed an attachment. The record is careful to call it nothing more, though the emotional reality must have been something far deeper, to a man named George. George was also enslaved on the Newsom farm. He was older than Celia. The trial record suggests they considered themselves partnered in whatever way was possible for two people who had no legal right to marry, no legal right to their own bodies, no legal right to choose anything at all. They had, by 1855, at least one child together, and Celia was pregnant again. George had asked Celia to stop the situation with Newsom. The trial record makes this clear, and it is one of the most heartbreaking details in a record full of heartbreaking details. George had told her that if she did not find a way to end what Newsom was doing to her, he would leave her. He could not bear it, he said. He would not stay. She was being raped by her enslaver and threatened with abandonment by the man she loved. This was her life in the spring of 1855. Celia did something that required extraordinary courage, or desperation, which in the circumstances were probably the same thing. She went to Robert Newsom's daughters, to Virginia and Mary. She told them what their father was doing. She asked them to intervene. She asked them to speak to him, to make him stop. We know from trial testimony what happened when she asked. Nothing. Nothing happened. Virginia and Mary Newsom were not monsters in the obvious sense. They were women who understood, as everyone on that farm understood, the terms of the world they lived in. Their father owned Celia. What he did with his property was his business. The law said so. The culture said so. The entire social order that kept them housed and fed and respectable said so. To challenge their father would have been to challenge every structure that made their own lives possible. They said nothing to him. And so by June of 1855, Celia had been raped for 5 years. She had asked for help and been refused. She had nowhere to go, physically, legally, socially nowhere. She was pregnant, exhausted, and living in a world in which every mechanism of authority existed to protect the man hurting her and to punish anyone who tried to stop him. She made her decision. The last ordinary moment before everything changed. The last moment that was simply a day on the farm, with heat and corn, and the sounds of the animals settling in the evening, was sometime in the hours before sunset on June 23rd. Celia was in her cabin. She had built a fire, which the heat of the evening made strange, though it would make sense later. She had gathered wood, including one large piece that she set aside, close to hand. She waited for Robert Newsom to come through the door. He did, as he always did. He always came. Robert Newsom was not, by the standards of Callaway County in 1855, a villain. That's the first thing you have to understand about him. He was not unusual. He was not extreme. He was not the kind of man who attracted negative attention from his neighbors or generated whispered warnings from the community. He was a farmer, a property owner, a member of the local church, a man who had raised children, buried a wife, managed a working farm, and accumulated the kind of modest wealth that passed for respectability in a county organized around agricultural production and the ownership of human beings. Eston. He was 60 years old when he died. His obituary, had one been written, and it wasn't, because he died under circumstances that made an obituary awkward, would have described him as a pillar of the community, a hard-working man, a good neighbor. He had been raping a child for 5 years. This is not a contradiction in the logic of the system that made him. It's a feature. Robert Newsom's behavior towards Celia was entirely within the legal and social norms of Missouri in 1855. He owned her. Under Missouri law, under federal law, under the logic of chattel slavery, as it had been constructed over 200 years of American history. What he did to her in that cabin was not rape. It could not be rape legally because rape was a crime committed against a person, and Celia was not legally a person. She was property. And American law, going back to the colonial era, had been meticulous about the distinction. Enslaved women had no legal protection against sexual violence by their enslavers. This was not an oversight. It was a deliberate construction. The legal codes of every slave state in the nation had been carefully written to ensure that the bodies of enslaved women were available to their owners without legal consequence. Why? Because the alternative was unthinkable. If enslaved women were recognized as having the right to refuse, then the entire system of coerced reproduction, the breeding of enslaved people to increase an owner's property value, the routine sexual use of enslaved women as one of the perquisites of ownership would become legally prosecutable. The economy of slavery depended, in part, on the absolute sexual availability of enslaved women. The law protected that dependency. Newsom's neighbors knew what he was doing. The kind of total transparency that exists on a working farm, where people live within sight and sound of each other, means that nothing of this kind stays truly private. They knew, the same way Virginia and Mary knew, the same way George knew. Nobody said anything because speaking would have meant acknowledging what the system required everyone to not say, that the man who did this to Celia was not aberrant. He was representative. He was what slavery looked like up close, in practice, on an ordinary farm in Little Dixie, Missouri, on an ordinary Tuesday in the summer of 1855. The specific mechanism of his power was absolute. He held the bill of sale. That piece of paper gave him every legal right to Celia's body, her labor, her children, who would be born enslaved, legally his property from the moment of their birth. The mechanism needed no threat, no violence in the conventional sense, because the threat was structural, total, and backed by the full authority of the state of Missouri. If Celia ran, the law would return her and punish her. If she resisted, the law would punish her. If she spoke, no court in Missouri would hear her testimony against a white man. She was trapped by architecture. The system's protection of Newsom was not personal. It was institutional. Missouri had patrol systems, slave codes, enforcement mechanisms specifically designed to prevent exactly what Celia eventually did. Those systems existed because the people who built them understood, clearly, that they were building something that required constant violence, implied or actual, to sustain. The patrols, the codes, the courts, the jails, all of it existed to tell enslaved people what Celia's 5 years on that farm had been telling her. There is no way out. The people who built that system also knew something else, that if it were ever forced to name itself honestly in the open language of a court of law, it would be exposed as what it was, not a natural order, not a divinely sanctioned arrangement, a machine for the extraction of labor and the suppression of human beings. Maintained by law and terror, Celia's trial was going to force that naming. The men in charge of the Missouri court system were not going to allow it. June 23, 1855. Late evening. The farm had gone quiet, in the way farms go quiet after sundown. Animals settled. The clatter of the day's work stilled the particular darkness of a rural Missouri night, pressing in around the outbuildings and the cabin where Celia slept. She had prepared as carefully as she knew how to prepare. The fire was going. She had selected a stick of wood from the pile near the hearth, heavy, roughly 2 feet long, the kind used to feed a fire. She had told no one what she planned. There was almost no one to tell who would not have been placed in an impossible position by the knowing. She heard him coming. The trial testimony does not dwell on this moment. The testimony is terse, procedural, as legal documents tend to be. But Celia gave a statement to the county sheriff in the hours after Newsom's body was found. And that statement is one of the few places in the record where her own voice appears, however filtered. She said she told him to leave her alone. She said she told him she would hurt him if he didn't go. He didn't go. Robert Newsom was a man who had entered that cabin without asking permission for 5 years. He was a man who had never once been told no by the legal or social structures around him. He was a man who had no reason to believe that anything had changed. He stepped toward her. She hit him with the stick. Hard enough to knock him down. She hit him again and again. The trial record records the cause of death as blows to the head. 2 strikes, possibly 3. Robert Newsom died on the floor of the cabin he had been treating as his private possession for 5 years. What came after, and this detail tells you everything you need to know about where Celia's head was in those hours, was not panic, or not only panic, it was calculation. She knew, with a clarity that came from 5 years of living in the most exposed possible relationship with this system, exactly what was going to happen when the sun came up. There was no universe in which she went free. The question was not whether she would be punished. The question was whether she could make the evidence of what she had done disappear. She spent the night burning the body. She used the fireplace. It took hours. She ground the larger bones with a rock. She scattered the ashes in the yard and near the path. She burned clothing, evidence, anything that could connect her to what had happened in the cabin. It was an extraordinary act of presence of mind in the middle of catastrophe. It wasn't enough. By morning, Robert Newsom's family had begun to look for him. He had not appeared for breakfast, which was unusual. His son Harry began searching the farm. Someone, the record suggests it was George, though the exact timeline is disputed, told the family what had happened. Celia was arrested that afternoon. Sheriff William Powell took her into custody. She told him, in the statement that would later be used against her in court, that she had done it, that she had hit him, that she had burned the body. She did not say she was sorry. She said he had been coming to her cabin against her will. She said she had asked him to stop. She said she had asked his daughters to make him stop. The sheriff wrote it all down. What he did with those facts, what the prosecuting attorney did with them, what the judge did with them. That is the rest of this story. The first person to understand that Celia's case was not just a murder trial, that it was something larger. Something that the legal system was going to have to handle very carefully, was a young attorney named John Jamison. Jamison was appointed to represent Celia by the Callaway County Court. He was not a famous lawyer, he was not an abolitionist. There is nothing in the historical record to suggest that he had any particular sympathy for the cause of enslaved people or any political commitment to challenging the slave system. He was a local attorney who was given a case and, by all available evidence, took it seriously. He was 31 years old in 1855. He had been practicing law in Callaway County for a few years, long enough to know the terrain, the judges, the prosecutors, the juries, the unspoken rules about what arguments could be made and which ones would cost a lawyer his standing in the community. He knew, when he read the facts of Celia's case, that the obvious defense, the only defense that fit the actual facts, was self-defense under Missouri's Rape Protection Statute, Missouri Revised Statutes, Section 29, passed in 1845. The law stated that it was legal for any woman to use force, including lethal force, to defend herself against rape or attempted rape. Jamison read those words. Any woman. He must have understood immediately what he was about to do. He was about to walk into a Missouri courtroom in 1855 and argue, on the record, that an enslaved black girl was any woman under the meaning of Missouri law. He was going to argue that a piece of property had the same right of self-defense as a free white woman. He had to know what that meant. He had to know what the reaction was going to be. He made the argument anyway. This is the detail about Jamison that keeps historians returning to his role in this case. He was not a hero in the romantic sense. He did not free Celia. He did not save her. His argument did not succeed. But in making it, in writing it into the formal legal record of the state of Missouri, he forced the court to respond. He forced the judge to rule on the question explicitly. He forced the system to say, out loud, in official language, what it had always preferred to handle through silence and omission. The moment Jamison filed his first motion, requesting that the judge instruct the jury that if Celia had acted in self-defense under the rape protection statute, they must acquit, he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The judge's name was William Hall. He would have to respond. He would have to write something down. And whatever he wrote, it would be a ruling about whether enslaved women were women. Jamison had forced the question into the open. What the system did with that question, how it answered it, how it tried to manage the answer, how it ultimately attempted to make the answer disappear. That is the story of the next 4 months. The trial of Celia did not happen in isolation. It happened in the context of a pattern of how Missouri courts handled the question of violence by enslaved people against their enslavers, and a pattern of how that legal system managed the contradiction between its stated principles and its operational reality. The pattern was already old by 1855. 2 years earlier, in 1853, a Missouri court had handled the case of an enslaved man named Randall, who had struck an overseer in self-defense. The overseer had beaten Randall with a board. Randall had taken the board away and hit back. The court ruled that enslaved people had no right of self-defense against any white person, overseer, or owner, under any circumstances. The ruling was crisp. The reasoning was explicit. To allow an enslaved person to strike a white person in self-defense was to undermine the fundamental authority relationship of slavery. Randall was hanged the same year as Celia's arrest, 1855. A case in neighboring Howard County involved an enslaved woman named Sally, who had been charged with assault after striking her enslaver's wife, who had been beating Sally with a fireplace poker. Sally survived. She was sold south, broken up from her children, transported to the Deep South cotton fields, which was understood in that era as a sentence nearly worse than execution. The Howard County Court produced no written ruling. The situation was handled quietly, administratively, without the messy paperwork of a formal trial. That was how Missouri preferred to handle these things. Quietly, without documentation. The danger of Celia's case, the reason it could not be handled quietly, was Jamison's insistence on making legal arguments that required written responses. Every motion he filed required a ruling. Every ruling was a document. Every document went into the court's bound record. The prosecuting attorney, a man named Robert Pruitt, understood this. He was a careful, experienced lawyer, and the record of his conduct in the Celia trial suggests that he was working as much to control the documentary record as to secure a conviction. The conviction was never in doubt. This was Callaway County, Missouri, in 1855. No jury was going to acquit an enslaved woman who had killed her enslaver. The question was, how to get that conviction while leaving the smallest possible footprint of the legal reasoning required to achieve it. Pruitt's strategy was to deny that the rape protection statute applied on procedural grounds. He argued that Celia hadn't proved rape had actually occurred, that her testimony couldn't be credited because she was the defendant. He argued that even if rape had occurred, the statute didn't apply to enslaved women. He argued multiple things, and the multiplicity was strategic. If the court could dispose of the case on any of several narrow grounds, the judge wouldn't have to issue a sweeping ruling about whether enslaved women were women. Jamison wouldn't let it go. He filed motion after motion. He filed a motion requesting that the jury be instructed on the self-defense statute. Denied. He filed a motion to have witnesses testify about Newsom's history of sexual violence toward Celia, to establish context and pattern. Denied. He filed a motion for a change of venue, arguing that Celia could not receive a fair trial in Callaway County, where virtually every potential juror was either an enslaver or economically dependent on the slave system. Denied. Every denial was written down. Every written denial was a document about what Missouri law said about enslaved women. The first truly significant rupture in the pattern came in mid-October, when Jamison filed his most aggressive motion, a direct request that the judge instruct the jury that, if the jury believes from the evidence that defendant was a slave and that the master had sexual intercourse with her, she was as much entitled to protect herself in such case as if she were a free white woman. He was asking the judge to put that sentence in front of the jury, to say it out loud. Judge Hall denied the motion. His written ruling, 3 paragraphs, careful, bloodless, said that the rape protection statute did not apply to enslaved persons. It did not say that enslaved women were not women. It was more careful than that. It said that the statute, as written, could not be read to provide enslaved persons with a right of self-defense against their enslavers, because such an interpretation would be contrary to the settled law of this state and the institutions of this community. The institutions of this community. That phrase was the admission. Not a moral admission. The law had no language for moral admissions, but a structural one. The judge was saying, in the clearest language, the system permitted. The answer to your question is no, not because of how the law reads, but because of how the institutions require it to read. Jamison put that ruling in the record. He let it sit there. The trial proceeded. If you're still with us, and you should be, because we are still in the part of this story where the system thinks it's winning. Thinks it's winning. Make sure you are subscribed to Hollow Century right now. What we are going through tonight has been sealed inside a Missouri courthouse archive for over a century. The people who managed this trial knew exactly what they were documenting. They knew it was damning. And when you hear what they did to try to keep it from being read, you're going to understand why this story matters so much right now. Hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what history looks like when you peel it open. And stay with us, because the trial has only just started, and Celia is not done fighting back to Missouri. The investigation into Celia's case, the one that eventually brought it to public attention, began not in Missouri, but in a graduate history seminar at Duke University in the late 1980s. The investigator was not a detective or a journalist. Her name was Melton McLaurin, and he was a historian, a professor who had spent his career studying the history of American labor and race. Not the sanitized version taught in survey courses, but the documentary record. The court records, the ledgers, the bills of sale, the correspondence, the depositions. McLaurin had been working on a book about the relationship between slavery and gender when a colleague mentioned, in passing, the Celia case. There had been brief references to it in the scholarly literature. A sentence here, a footnote there, but no one had ever done a full reconstruction. The primary documents had never been published. McLaurin went to find them. What he encountered in the Missouri State Archives was the thing that researchers in the history of slavery encounter everywhere. A record that had been shaped by the interests of the people who created it. The court records from Callaway County in the 1850s existed. They had survived, but they were not organized in any way that made Celia's case easy to find. They were bundled with hundreds of other county court records, cataloged in ways that reflected 19th century archival practices, which is to say, practices oriented entirely around the interests and activities of white male property owners. Celia appeared in those records as a defendant, a Negro woman, property of the late Robert Newsom. Her story had been preserved inside a system that had never intended to preserve it. Preserved because legal records are kept, because the paper trail of a capital case is too voluminous to completely destroy, because somewhere between the judge's determination to avoid making a sweeping ruling and Jameson's insistence on filing written motions, enough got written down that it couldn't be entirely erased. McLaurin spent months in those archives. He cross-referenced the court record with county histories, church records, newspaper accounts, land records, the census data. He found Jameson's motions. He found Judge Hall's denials. He found the trial transcript. He found the sentencing order. He found one more thing, something that, when he encountered it, must have changed the temperature of the room. A record of a habeas corpus petition, filed on Celia's behalf while she was awaiting execution. Jamison had not given up. After the conviction, after the death sentence, he had filed an emergency appeal to the Missouri Supreme Court. He had argued, again, in writing, creating another document, that Celia's constitutional rights had been violated by the exclusion of the self-defense instruction. He had asked the court to order a new trial. The Missouri Supreme Court had received the petition. And then something happened that no court would ordinarily do. The Missouri Supreme Court, confronted with a habeas corpus petition that would require them to issue a ruling on whether enslaved women could invoke self-defense, a ruling that would have to be published, that would become precedent, that could be cited by abolitionists, printed in newspapers, entered into the national argument about slavery, had declined to hear it. Not denied, declined. They had found a procedural reason not to engage with the question. The ruling was 3 sentences. The case was returned to the county level. 2 weeks later, Celia was hanged. McLaurin sat with those documents for a long time. The pattern he was looking at, the motions filed, the denials issued, the appeal deflected, the execution carried out, was the pattern of a system that had understood exactly what was being asked of it and had worked methodically to avoid answering. The system had been asked to name itself. It had found every procedural mechanism available to avoid doing so. And it had killed Celia rather than be forced to say, in the clean language of law, what it was. McLaurin published his book in 1991. Celia, a slave. It was the first time the full record of her case had been brought to public attention. 136 years after she died, Celia finally had a witness. The record is thin. This is, itself, part of the story. The deliberate thinness of the documentary record around people the law regarded as things. But the voices are there, if you know where to find them. George, the man Celia had been partnered with on the Newsom farm. His testimony in the trial record is the most extensive account of Celia's situation. He described the relationship between Celia and Newsom with the kind of direct, flat specificity that comes from someone who has no illusions left. He confirmed that Newsom had been having sexual relations with Celia since she arrived on the farm. He confirmed that Celia had tried to end it. He confirmed that he had told her he could not continue their relationship if the situation continued. He said this under oath, in open court, to a jury that was going to convict her anyway. George's testimony was used by the prosecution to establish that Celia had a motive. He had given her an ultimatum. He had threatened to leave her. This, the prosecution argued, was why she acted. Not self-defense, but premeditation motivated by the desire to keep George's affection. The prosecution turned a man's threat to abandon a woman who was being raped into evidence of her guilt. George was never charged with anything. He continued to live and work on the Newsom farm. Virginia Newsom, Robert's daughter. Her testimony was careful, precise. She confirmed that Celia had approached her and asked for help. She said she had not spoken to her father about the matter. She said, and this is the sentence that appears in the record with no surrounding commentary, no visible reaction from the court, just a flat factual statement, that she had not felt it was her place to interfere with her father's business. She used those words. Virginia Newsom outlived Celia by decades. She married, had children, died at an advanced age in Missouri. No record survives of whether she ever spoke of Celia again. John Jameson, the most important witness to his own actions, and the one who left the most. His motions, his arguments, his filed documents. These are functionally testimony. They are the record of a man who understood what was happening and chose, in the narrow way available to him within the system, to make it visible. He could not save Celia. He knew that. What he could do was force the system to write down its reasons. And he did that with a methodical persistence that is, in retrospect, remarkable. He filed the motion requesting jury instruction on the self-defense statute. He filed the motion requesting testimony about Newsom's history. He filed the appeal. He filed the habeas petition. Every one of those filings said, "This is not justice." I am noting, for the record, that this is not justice. After the execution, Jameson left Callaway County. He moved west. The historical record does not show what happened to him after that. He disappears into the silence of a life that no one thought was important enough to document. But his filings remained in the county courthouse, in the state archive, waiting for McLaurin to find them a century and a half later. He had built a paper trail with his own hands. He had built it knowing that the case was lost, that Celia was going to die, that no one in Missouri in 1855 was going to read those documents and be moved to justice. He built it anyway. That act, that stubborn, unspectacular, legally futile act of documentation is why we know this story at all. Celia's resistance did not begin on the night of June 23rd. It had been building for 5 years, and it did not end when she was arrested. The first resistances were the small ones, the only kind available. She asked. That was the first act. In a world designed to make enslaved people mute, she found words. She went to Virginia and Mary Newsom, and she used language to describe what was being done to her, and she asked them to make it stop. She asked knowing that it might not work. She asked knowing that the asking itself could be punished, that an enslaved woman who complained about her enslaver's sexual behavior was a problem to be managed, not a person to be helped. She asked anyway. The asking was not naive. It was strategic. She was testing the social structures around her, probing for any crack in the wall, any mechanism she hadn't tried yet. She was doing what people in impossible situations do when they have not yet given up. She was looking for the exit. When the asking failed, she escalated. The trial record references, briefly, almost in passing, that Celia had threatened Newsom, had told him that if he came to the cabin again, she would hurt him. This is presented in the prosecution's narrative as evidence of premeditation. She had threatened him. Therefore, the killing was planned. But read another way, the threat was a final attempt to use the only leverage she had, the possibility of violence, to create a boundary that no law and no social norm would create for her. He ignored the threat. He came anyway. The decision to act, to pick up the stick, was itself a form of resistance that went beyond any individual act of self-preservation. It was an assertion. It was Celia saying, "My body belongs to me. The law says it doesn't. Robert Newsom's bill of sale says it doesn't. The entire social order of Callaway County, Missouri says it doesn't. But I say it does, and I am going to act on what I say." The burning of the body was resistance too. Methodical, intelligent resistance. She understood a forensics at the level available to a 19-year-old in 1855 who had never attended a day of school, but who had spent 5 years observing everything around her. She understood that the body was evidence. She understood that if the body were destroyed, the case against her would be circumstantial. She worked through the night to give herself the best possible chance. It wasn't enough, but that was because of George's betrayal, which is itself one of the most painful threads in this story. George, who had been her partner, who had told her he would leave her if she didn't end the situation, told the Newsom family what she had done before the investigation had even begun. Whether this was fear, survival instinct, an attempt to protect himself from suspicion, the record doesn't tell us what George was feeling. We know only what he did. He told. In the courtroom, Celia's resistance continued in only form available to her there. She testified truthfully. This was, in the context of 1855 Missouri, an act of defiance. She could have constructed a story. She could have claimed an accident, a struggle, anything that might have introduced reasonable doubt. She told the truth instead, that she had been raped, that she had asked for help and been refused, that she had acted in self-defense. She told the truth, knowing it was going to get her killed. This was not an irrational choice. By telling the truth, she forced the court to respond to the truth. She forced Jameson to make the self-defense argument. She forced Judge Hall to write down his ruling. She forced the Missouri Supreme Court to decline a hearing rather than rule directly. She forced all of that documentation into existence by refusing to give the system the easier story it wanted. The documentation that McLaurin found 136 years later, the paper trail that brought her story to light, exists because Celia refused to make it easier for the system to kill her quietly. Her resistance in the end was what survived. The most important act of resistance in the Celia case was not the killing. It was the telling. She told George. She told the sheriff. She told her lawyer. She told the court. She said out loud over and over in every venue available to a 19-year-old enslaved girl in 1855 Missouri. This is what happened to me. This is what was done to me. I want you to know. She wanted someone to know. And through Jameson's motions and Judge Hall's denials and McLaurin's decades later scholarship, someone eventually did. The cover-up of the Celia case operated on 3 levels. Understanding all 3 is essential to understanding why it took over a century for her story to reach the public. The first level was the immediate one. The management of the trial itself. Judge Hall's handling of the Jameson motions was, as we've seen, methodical. Every potentially precedent-setting argument was deflected, denied, or disposed of on the narrowest possible grounds. The self-defense instruction was refused, not because the judge issued a sweeping ruling that enslaved women weren't women, a ruling that would have been incendiary, that abolitionists would have reprinted in every northern newspaper, but because the settled law of this state didn't support it. The narrowness was intentional. The goal was to kill Celia without creating a documented ruling that named the logic required to kill her. The Missouri Supreme Court's handling of the appeal took this further. A habeas corpus petition is a formal legal document that requires a formal response. The court found a way to return the petition to the county level without issuing a written ruling at all. This was legally unusual. The purpose of the Supreme Court is precisely to rule on questions of law. The court chose procedure over substance. It chose silence over clarity. This was not accidental. The timing of the case, fall and early winter 1855, in the middle of the bleeding Kansas crisis, at the peak of national argument about slavery, made the political stakes of a written ruling unmistakable. A Missouri Supreme Court ruling that said enslaved women are not women under the rape protection statute would have been used by abolitionists as evidence of what slavery required the law to say about human beings. It would have been politically catastrophic, so they found a reason not to rule. They let Celia die without creating the document that would have made the logic explicit. The second level of cover-up was archival. After the execution, after the immediate crisis was over, the trial record sat in the Callaway County Courthouse as part of the general county court record. It was not sealed exactly. It was never formally classified or restricted. It was simply unfiled. Filed in the sense that it was never organized in any way that would make it accessible to someone looking for it. It was bundled with hundreds of other records in boxes that were cataloged under the names of white male property owners. Celia appeared only as a defendant, a piece of property, not as someone whose case deserved indexing. This is how archives work when they are built by and for the powerful. Important things disappear, not because they are hidden, but because the finding aids, the indices, the catalogs, the finding tools are built to make some things findable and other things invisible. For 130 years, researchers looking into the history of slavery in Missouri had no easy way to know that the Celia trial record existed, let alone where to find it. McLaurin found it only because he had the resources, the institutional access, and the specific scholarly focus to spend months in the archive looking. Most people don't have those things. The third level of cover-up was cultural. The systematic exclusion of enslaved women's experiences from the historical narrative of slavery itself. By the late 19th century, the narrative of American slavery that was gaining dominance, particularly in the former slave states, was the lost cause mythology. Slavery as a benevolent institution, enslaved people as content, and well cared for, the Civil War as a struggle over states' rights, rather than the preservation of human bondage. This mythology required the erasure of the documentary record of slavery's actual violence. Narratives like Celia's, which exposed the sexual violence that was structural to slavery, which showed the legal system's active complicity in that violence, were directly incompatible with the lost cause mythology. They were not erased by being burned or hidden. They were erased by being omitted from the histories that got written, from the textbooks that got printed, from the commemorations and monuments and civic narratives that shaped how communities understood their own past. Celia's name did not appear in any major history of Missouri that McClure could find before 1991. She had been tried in open court, convicted, hanged, and disappeared. Not from the archive, but from the story that Missouri told itself about its own history. The cover-up was successful for a very long time. We're past the halfway point of this story, and if you haven't subscribed to Hollow Century yet, this is the moment. What you've just heard, the trial, the denial, the appeal that went nowhere, the execution that was carried out exactly as planned. This is the history that disappears from textbooks, not because it was lost, but because it was inconvenient, because it was too clear about what slavery required the law to say. Hit that like button. Leave us a comment. Share this with someone who needs to understand that the history we weren't taught is not missing. It's buried. And stay with us. Because in the second half of this story, the truth starts fighting back. The climax of Celia's story is not a single dramatic moment. It is a slow, grinding collision between a system that believed it had managed a dangerous situation and the stubborn persistence of the truth it had tried to manage. October 1855. Callaway County Courthouse. The trial took 3 days. It was brief by any standard, and especially brief for a capital case in which the defense attorney was raising novel legal arguments. 3 days for a 19-year-old's life. The prosecution's case was simple and effective. Celia had killed Robert Newsom. The body, or what remained of it, had been recovered from the ashes of her cabin's fireplace. Witnesses had confirmed that she had told them she did it. The physical evidence was consistent with the account. The verdict was never in serious doubt. Jamison's arguments were heard and denied. His requests for jury instructions on self-defense were refused. His motions to admit evidence of Newsom's sexual violence were denied. His request for a change of venue was denied. The jury deliberated briefly. The verdict was guilty of first-degree murder. Judge Hall sentenced Celia to death by hanging. The date was set for November 16, 1855. Then something happened that disrupted the timetable, and that created, accidentally, the most important window of opportunity in the entire case. Celia gave birth. She had been pregnant throughout the trial. Sometime in early November, while awaiting execution, she delivered a child. The baby did not survive. The record notes this without elaboration. The death of an enslaved infant in Missouri in 1855 warranted one line: the execution was postponed. It was rescheduled for December 21, 1855. In those 6 weeks, the 6 weeks between the verdict and the rescheduled execution, Jamison made his last attempt. He filed the habeas corpus petition to the Missouri Supreme Court. He made the argument one more time, in writing, for the record. This woman acted in self-defense. Missouri law protects any woman who acts in self-defense against rape. Celia is a woman. She is entitled to the protection of this statute. The Missouri Supreme Court received the petition in late November. McLaurin's research, working from court records and communications between the court and county officials, established that the justices were aware of the petition and its implications. The court had time to act before the scheduled execution date. It chose not to. The court found a procedural basis. The petition had been filed incorrectly at the county level, or the transcription was incomplete, or some other technical deficiency, and returned it without ruling. The record of this deflection is buried in the bureaucratic correspondence of the court. December 21, 1855. Celia was taken from the Callaway County Jail in the early morning hours. The execution was a public event. Hangings in that era typically were the civic theater of punishment, serving as both deterrent and demonstration of the system's authority. Callaway County's prominent citizens attended. The newspaper reported it in several sentences. She was 19 years old. She had been on the Newsom farm for 5 years. She had asked for help and been refused. She had acted in the only way remaining to her. She had told the truth in court. She had watched every legal mechanism fail to protect her. She died without, as far as the record shows, recanting anything. The hanging took place in the morning. By afternoon, the legal records of her case had begun their long journey into the obscurity of the Callaway County Archive, where they would sit for 136 years. The system believed it had managed the situation. It had killed a woman rather than admit what she was. It had refused to rule on whether enslaved women were women. It had gotten a conviction without producing a written ruling that could be reprinted in abolitionist newspapers. In its own terms, the system had succeeded. What it had not anticipated, could not have anticipated, in 1855 was McLaurin. Was the archive's accidental preservation? Was the persistence of paper? Was the way that, in a free society, the things that are buried eventually become the things people most want to find? The execution of Celia was an act of institutional self-preservation. The record of that execution was an act of institutional self-exposure. They had written it all down because they had no choice. And what they wrote down was the story of what they were, what happened to everyone in this story. The complete accounting. Celia, hanged December 21st, 1855. She was buried where, the record does not say. No grave marker, no formal documentation of burial. She was property, and the disposition of property after its destruction is administrative, not commemorative. For 136 years, she had no public memorial. In 1991, when McLaurin's book was published, she became the subject of academic and then broader public attention. In 2007, the Missouri Senate passed a resolution recognizing her case as a significant piece of Missouri history. There is, as of this writing, no monument to Celia in Callaway County. There are monuments to the Confederacy. There is a courthouse where the trial was held. Her name is not on the building. Robert Newsom died June 23, 1855. He was 60 years old. The trial record notes that he was buried in the local churchyard, though the specific location is not documented. His estate, the farm, the enslaved people, the property, was distributed to his children. There was no legal process that examined his conduct towards Celia. There was no posthumous accounting. He died as he had lived, a respected property owner, whatever the private knowledge of his neighbors. George, the trial record places him on the Newsom farm after Celia's arrest. He was not charged with any crime. He was not punished for his relationship with Celia or for his testimony against her. He appears in no subsequent records that McLaurin was able to locate. Like so many enslaved people in this period, he dissolves into the archive's silence after the event that made him visible. He was a man caught in an impossible situation who made the choice to survive at Celia's expense. History has no verdict on him, only the fact of what he did. Virginia and Mary Newsom both survived. Virginia, the elder daughter, married within a few years of the trial and continued to live in Callaway County. She appeared in census records through the 1880s. No surviving document records whether she spoke of Celia after 1855. Mary disappears from the accessible record more completely. Neither appears to have faced any social consequence for their failure to intervene when Celia came to them. They were protected by the same logic that protected their father. A woman did not interfere with her father's business. Harry Newsom, Robert's son, managed the farm after his father's death, continued to hold the remaining enslaved people on the Newsom property. Like his sisters, he suffered no social or legal consequence. He appears in county records through the Civil War era. John Jameson departed Callaway County after the execution. McLaurin's research traced him to western Missouri and then into Kansas Territory, where he appeared in legal records in the late 1850s. He does not appear to have built a notable career. He does not appear to have spoken or written publicly about the Celia case. Whatever his internal reckoning with the failure, with the execution, with the system's successful management of the question he had forced into the open, he carried it with him into a life that the historical record declined to document. What he left behind was the paper trail, the motions, the arguments, the documents that made McLaurin's work possible. In death, his persistence had more consequence than his survival. The record he created outlasted everything else about him. Judge William Hall continued on the Callaway County bench. He was re-elected. He remained a respected figure in the Missouri legal community. His ruling, the 3 paragraphs that disposed of Jameson's self-defense argument by reference to the settled law of this state, was never challenged, never overturned, never even publicly discussed in his lifetime. He died in office, decades later, a man who had managed a dangerous situation with quiet efficiency. The enslaved people of Callaway County, the Civil War began 5.5 years after Celia's execution. Missouri remained a border state throughout the conflict, a place where slavery persisted legally even as the war reshaped the nation around it. Emancipation came to Missouri in January 1865, 8 months before the 13th Amendment was ratified. The people who had been enslaved on the Newsom farm, who had watched Celia arrested, tried, and executed, were freed into a world that had no mechanism for reckoning with what had been done to them, no legal process for addressing the theft of their labor, their bodies, their families, their lives. The transition from slavery to freedom was not a transition to justice. It was a transition to a different set of structures: sharecropping, black codes, convict leasing, designed to perpetuate economic dependency and suppress political power. What happened to the people who had known Celia, who had lived alongside her on that farm, who had watched her die? That story is also buried, also waiting for someone to find it. Melton McLaurin published Celia, a Slave, in 1991. The book went through multiple printings. It became widely assigned in university courses on the history of slavery, gender, and American law. It won awards. It brought Celia's name back from the silence. McLaurin spent the rest of his career at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, where he continued to teach and write about the history of American race and labor. He died in 2012. His book remains in print. The case continues to be cited in legal scholarship, particularly in work on the legal history of rape, rap, self-defense, and the definition of personhood. Celia's question, was she a woman, has never stopped being relevant. The document that broke this case open was not a single piece of paper. It was a collection of papers: Jameson's motions, Judge Hall's rulings, the trial transcript, the sentencing order, the habeas petition, the Supreme Court's deflection. The Supreme Court's deflection that together told a story more complete and more damning than any single document could have told alone. The hiding was architectural, not deliberate. The Callaway County Court record from 1855 was preserved, not destroyed, not sealed, not formally suppressed. It was simply stored in the way that 19th century county courts stored records, in bound volumes and bundled folders, organized by date and docket number, cataloged under the names of the principal parties. In a capital case, the principal party was the defendant. The defendant was listed as Celia, Negro woman, property of Robert Newsom, deceased. That was her entry in the index. There was no flag, no cross-reference, no notation that said. This case contains a novel and consequential legal argument about the definition of personhood under Missouri law. There was no reason for anyone to put that notation there. Decades, the people who created the record had no interest in making it findable. The people who maintained the archive in subsequent decades had no reason to prioritize it. The waiting lasted 136 years. During those years, Missouri went through the Civil War, Reconstruction, the rise of Jim Crow, 2 world wars, the Civil Rights Movement, the assassination of Martin Luther King, and the first stirrings of what would become the mass incarceration era. Through all of it, Celia's record sat in the archive, preserved by the bureaucratic inertia of a system that files everything and forgets most of it. The finding happened because of a coincidence of timing and obsession. McLaurin had the specific scholarly focus, the history of enslaved women's experiences, that sent him looking for exactly this kind of case. He had the institutional access to spend months in the Missouri State Archives. He had the persistence to trace partial references in secondary sources back to primary documents that those secondary sources had barely engaged with. He found the Jameson motions first, he later recalled. The specificity of the legal argument, the explicit invocation of the rape protection statute, the explicit claim that Celia was any woman within its meaning, stopped him cold. He had been looking for cases where the legal system had been forced to address the contradiction between slavery and womanhood. Here was one. Here was one where an attorney had made the argument explicitly, and the court had been forced to respond. He pulled the full record. The shock was not in any single document. Though Hall's ruling, with its phrase about the institutions of this community, is as clear a window into the logic of slavery as anything in the legal record, the shock was in the accumulation, motion after motion, ruling after ruling, deflection after deflection. A documentary record of a system working methodically to process a woman's life and death while avoiding the explicit statement of what that processing required. They had never said, "Enslaved women are not women." They had never had to say it. They had disposed of every argument that required them to say it on procedural grounds, and they had killed Celia before the Supreme Court could be forced to rule. The documentation survived because too many people had to write too many things down. A judge's ruling must be written. A motion must be written. A sentencing order must be written. A habeas petition must be written. The bureaucratic weight of capital legal proceedings meant that the record accumulated beyond any individual actor's ability to control it. The verification came through the cross-referencing that McLaurin performed, newspaper accounts matching dates in the court record, census data confirming the identities of the principals, church records confirming the Newsom family's presence in Callaway County. Nothing McLaurin found contradicted the core record. Everything confirmed it. The publication in 1991 was, in the world of academic history, an event. But it was slow to reach wider public consciousness, as academic books tend to be. The spread of Celia's story into broader American historical awareness happened over the decade following publication, as the book was adopted into university curricula, as citations multiplied in legal and historical scholarship, as the case began to appear in broader histories of slavery and American women's legal history. The story survived. After 136 years of institutional silence, after an execution designed in part to avoid creating a clear documentary record of what it required, after an archive that made the record difficult to find, and a scholarly tradition that had not looked for it, the story survived because Jameson wrote it down, because Celia told the truth, because the paper is still there. Here is what the Celia case actually was. It was a test of what American law would say, under pressure, about who counted as a person. The men who controlled Missouri's legal system in 1855 understood the question. They understood it so clearly that they spent 4 months maneuvering to avoid answering it explicitly, deflecting Jameson's motions on procedural grounds, finding a bureaucratic escape from the Supreme Court appeal, executing Celia before a definitive ruling could be forced. They were not confused about what was being asked of them. They were not incapable of understanding the argument. They understood it perfectly, and they chose, collectively and deliberately, to avoid answering it in writing. Because the answer, the honest answer, the answer required by the logic of the system they were operating, was that Celia was not a woman under Missouri law, that she had no right of self-defense, that a man could rape her every night for 5 years, and she could be executed for stopping him, and that this was not a flaw in the system. It was the system, naming that explicitly in a published Supreme Court ruling in 1855, in the middle of the national argument about slavery. That was too dangerous. It would have been handed to every abolitionist newspaper in the country. It would have made the question unavoidable. Is this what you are defending? So, they killed her, instead of answering the question. And then they buried the record. The institutions that built and maintained slavery were not run by stupid people. They were run by careful people who understood exactly what they were doing and worked methodically to preserve it. The violence of slavery was always accompanied by the management of its visibility, the careful curation of what got written down, what got printed, what got commemorated, what got taught to children. The archive of slavery is an archive that was shaped by the people who built slavery and the people who needed to justify it after the fact. What appears in that archive and what doesn't is not an accident. Celia's case almost didn't appear. The fact that it does, the fact that we can trace it, reconstruct it, tell it tonight, is because one attorney refused to make it easy. Because a 19-year-old girl told the truth in court when lying might have helped her case. Because paper persists past the people who created it. Because McLaurin spent months in an archive looking for exactly this. And because once the truth is written down, it has a way of eventually being found. I want to ask you 3 questions before we go. Not rhetorical questions. Questions I genuinely want you to think about. First, the legal argument Jameson made, that any woman includes enslaved women, failed in 1855. What does it mean that the legal system's answer to that argument was an execution rather than a ruling? What does that tell us about how systems protect themselves from questions they can't afford to answer? Second, Celia told the truth in court when the truth was going to get her killed. She had every reason to construct a different story. She didn't. What do you think she understood about what the truth, once stated, could do, even in a courtroom that was going to ignore it? Third, McLaurin found this case in 1988. That's 36 years ago. What cases are sitting in archives right now that no one has gone looking for yet? What stories are still buried, not because they were destroyed, but because no one has built the finding aids that would make them visible? The history that was designed to be forgotten is not gone. It is in the archives, in the court records, in the ledgers, in the paper trails that systems create when they process human lives and call it law. Someone has to go looking. Someone has to care enough to sit in the room with the boxes and follow the trail. That is the work. It is slow. It is often unglamorous. It does not look like a dramatic rescue. But Celia got a witness. 136 years late, but she got one. Every buried story deserves one. So steward to Hollow Century for more of these stories. Hit that notification bell because we are not close to done. There are archives full of cases like this, cases that changed the shape of the world that the world was never allowed to know about. Hit that like button if this story reached you. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that history is not a finished argument. It is an ongoing one, and the truth has not yet been heard from entirely. I'll see you in the next one.